The 7th chapter of Genesis tells of a flood event that covered the entire earth, but most secular scientists, and even many Christians, doubt that such a catastrophe could ever happen. But our planet's rocks provide ample evidence that such an event did, in fact, occur. Join ICR science staff as they travel across the American West, demonstrating the very real evidence of a global flood that occurred about 4,500 years ago. The rocks show individual layers that have been spread across vast areas of the West, many of them more extensive than the last. Today, stacks of these rocks measure thousands of feet thick, indicating a progressive flood event just like the one described in Genesis. To claim that no evidence exists for a global flood is to ignore the scientific evidence left behind. The flood left substantial signs that confirm Scripture. Truly, the evidence has been carved in stone. Just outside of Cody, Wyoming, Hart Mountain rises more than 8,000 feet above the floor of the Bighorn Basin. Evolutionary naturalists find it difficult to explain this geologic feature's existence, but flood geology can provide insights into where it came from. Join Dr. Clary as he discusses this marvelous evidence of the Genesis flood. Now, Dr. Clary, both secular geologists and flood geologists find Hart Mountain to be quite fascinating. Why is that?
Hart Mountain has been a mystery or an enigma to secular geologists for well over 100 years. It appears that you have a carbonate block that's over 1,000 foot thick that moved and slid on about a 2-degree slope over 30 miles. So this piece of rock behind us actually slid 30 miles on almost a flat slope. So there had to be something unusual taking place. Every geology student takes a structural geology class and studies about Hart Mountain, but nobody really seems to solve the mystery. Well, I think the flood gives us the best explanation for it. This thing moved catastrophically as the floodwaters are starting to recede, so a lot of this was probably still underwater when this moved and slid. And even the secular geologists have estimated now this might have moved over 100 miles per hour.
100 miles an hour.
And so they think it might have moved on a cushion of supercritical CO2 because it formed right in the middle of a carbonate layer or a limestone type layer. Really, in this case, it was a dolomite, but it broke and slid, again, about a 2-degree slope, 30 miles. And there's a lot of other pieces that broke as well and slid from this breakaway zone almost to the edge of Yellowstone National Park. Pushed these really early flood rocks on top of some of the receding flood rocks actually in the Bighorn Basin. So it's quite a change. For a long time, many people couldn't explain it. They didn't know if it really moved because it moved almost on a bedding plane right along within a dolomite layer. But eventually it did push out over on top of the younger rocks. So we got older rocks on top of younger rocks, and that's what makes it an overthrust.
So once again, we find that the creation geology, the flood geology explanation seems to fit the facts better.
Hart Mountain and the whole thrust and all the different pieces that moved with it, moved 20 to 30 miles, in this case almost 30, can only be explained by the flood. The flood provides the conditions for fluid pressures to build up real rapidly by rapid burial, rapid buildup of sediments as the floodwaters were depositing the sediments. And then all you need is a little bit of volcanic activity, possibly out of Yellowstone, in the receding phase to kind of get this whole thing started, and off that slide went. So you have this slide that moved 20 to 30 miles. Many other pieces moved a little bit less than that, but they moved because of the flood conditions that were brought on by the global flood.
A mountain that moves rapidly over flat surfaces can be explained by the incredible forces involved in a global flood. But Hart Mountain didn't move alone. It's part of a greater fault known as the Hart Mountain Detachment. Can this fault line give us insight into some of the mechanics of the Genesis flood? Dr. Clary visits the Dead Indian Summit to survey the surrounding area. And Dr. Clary, what about it? What do we find in regard to the Hart Mountain Fault?
Well, we've been driving closer and closer to the breakaway or the detachment zone for the Hart Mountain Fault. So it's a little bit unusual in some ways that there's an actually defined zone where it broke away and slid. And remember, Hart Mountain slid about 30 miles. Well, behind us here, you can see a couple of remnants. Those white, tan-colored bluff hills are all Hart Mountain blocks that slid as well. They just didn't slide quite as far. So Hart Mountain wasn't just the Hart Mountain per se, it was a bunch of pieces. The slide included about 30 major pieces that all kind of slid this way from the breakaway zone to the west. Now what's unusual here is here we're still in what's called the bedding plane mode, or the bedding plane surface, so it didn't actually slide older rocks over younger rocks. We're in the zone that it detached at. If you were to measure this, you would think there's almost no fault at all, because it almost moved at a knife blade surface from that high pressure that was floating on. So that high catastrophic pressure that had built up as a consequence of the rapid deposition during the flood, finally when it broke away and slid, actually this area was still sliding on its bedding plane surface, so it didn't rise at all.
So we have a lot of catastrophic movement of a whole bunch of real estate in a short period of time. It doesn't take the hundreds of thousands of years that is posited by the evolutionary naturalists.
Right, and a lot of the detachment surface was actually preserved. Even the USGS geologist that mapped it said it must have been buried and covered with Yellowstone volcanics within hours or days at the most after this detachment moved, because you preserve that flat detachment surface perfectly. So these are blocks back here that slid, and in between these blocks you can still see the detachment surface, but they're covered now with volcanics in many places. But it's amazing how even secular geologists will admit that this stuff had to be catastrophic, had to happen extremely fast, exactly what we think is the conditions during the flood. Catastrophic movement, all set up by the conditions of the flood.
As Dr. Clary said, even secular scientists admit that the Hart Mountain detachment had to occur in catastrophic conditions. Next, he heads to Devil's Tower, an astounding monument that juts up from the prairie surrounding the Black Hills. Where does such a geologic feature fit into the Genesis flood? Dr. Clary, this area is absolutely amazing because of this incredible geologic monument behind us. It causes awe and wonder with anybody who looks at it. But how about it? How about a young Earth creationist explanation for such an incredible structure?
The big columns we see on it, those big long lines that come down, those are called columnar jointing, because they make columns, so they're called columnar jointing. And really what they are is a type of cooling artifact. And so geologists study these. We've seen them in Giant's Causeway in Ireland. You see them in Yellowstone, you see these columns that form. In this case, so they're really, really big. So I don't know if there's enough studies done to show the bigger, they cooled quicker or slower. But nonetheless, this is a cooling artifact as this intrusion came in. Now, how it fits in the flood story is these intruded into the rocks during the receding phase, during the Tejas mega sequence. And so early in the receding phase, these big magmas came in, and probably because of the plate tectonic activity that was taking place underneath the Earth, magmas were generated during the receding phase, and these intrusions kind of came in. And what's even more amazing is the sediments they intruded into were probably still soft, and so they were easily intruded in. And as the water finally did recede all the way off, it also eroded away a lot of those sediments and exposed this 800-foot high monolith that we see behind us. So it's really just an artifact of the erosion, the resistance to erosion, because lavas are more resistant than the sediments. And so those sedimentary units that were deposited during the flood were easily eroded off and leaving behind this lava.
Columnar joints point to Devil's Tower being formed during the receding phase of the flood just thousands of years ago. What other evidences does the state of Wyoming have for us? The Teton Range stands tall over the surrounding area, hosting pristine lakes, a host of wildlife, and gorgeous terrain. Dr. Clary visits Grand Teton National Park to discuss the age of these beautiful peaks. Dr. Clary, looking at the sharp features of these mountains, it seems to indicate youth. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. These are the actual youngest mountains in the Rocky Mountains. They formed late in the receding phase. They kind of popped up along a large fault that runs the length of the Grand Tetons. You can see how rugged they are as they go up. It's called the Teton Fault, and that fault has about 15 to 20,000 feet of throw on it. 15 to 20,000 feet. And so a tremendous amount of throw, and they came up very, very late as the waters were receding, probably later in the Tejas mega sequence, and therefore you have this very rugged range, which I think is probably the most beautiful mountain range in all of the United States.
So late in the Genesis flood, we find that this unique type of mountain range is one of the last to come up.
That's correct. And they were also affected by the Ice Age. You don't have the continental glaciers here, you had alpine glaciers, mountain glaciers that came through here, and you can see the U-shaped valleys in between the mountain ranges back behind you. In between each mountain range, you can see these U-shaped valleys. And the glaciers formed during the Ice Age, came out, pushed a lot of debris into the valley floor, and those moraines, or that glacial debris, was carried out by the ice. And you can see all across here, we see evidence of ice ages, including these lakes, like Jenny Lake and Jackson Lake, that were kind of dammed up by these moraines.
So the mountains, the moraines, the lakes, all have an appearance of youth and fits beautifully with the biblical catastrophic model.
Exactly, and they show exactly what we see everywhere else. We see evidence of a flood, we see evidence of catastrophic activity, in this case a fault that moved the rocks up, and then we see evidence of glaciers that came through later at the end of the flood that brought up these big U-shaped valleys, in this case, carved out these valleys and left behind its remnants as lakes like Jenny Lake and Jackson Lake. Join us next time as we dig even deeper for answers. Truly, the evidence has been carved in stone.